Welcome to the 16th lesson of Biblical Hebrew course. This is the last lesson, and we will talk about the so-called weak roots in Hebrew. The thing is that, we've seen a lot of verbs in different forms, different conjugations, and these conjugations have been characterized by certain, by lengthenings here and there, prefixes and so on, and you've always been able to spot the three root consonants. Now, the so-called weak verbs are characterized by one or more of the three root consonants being completely or partially without sound value, losing part of their sound value, if not all of it. That has to do that. For instance, the consonant nun will, assimilate in some forms. That's actually only when the nun is the first root of the first letter of the root. It will assimilate in some forms. Also, yud and vav will become vowels or disappear in some of the forms if they're part of the root. And aleph is sometimes weak. And then we have a special kind of original two radical nouns where there were only two consonants, and then, one of the consonants could be long. We call those geminate verbs because sometimes that long consonant will geminate. You'll get two consonants, two identical consonants. Or the other type of two radical root is what we call sometimes the hollow roots or middle vav roots, where in between the two consonants there's a long vowel. That's a particular type of verb, which with the inflection of which is slightly different from the others. Now, the good news is that the prefixes that you've learned and the endings that you've learned are still the same. So you can always, when you know the basic inflection of the Hebrew verb, you can always recognize what form it is, what form any verb is in terms of gender, number, and person. Good. So, another, let's say, from the same family as this, we have the roots with the gutturals. Guttural letters, we've seen that the guttural letters do not lengthen. So whenever they were supposed to lengthen because they were a piel or a nifal imperfect, then they simply don't lengthen. Sometimes a vowel is lengthened instead, sometimes not. So you have to recognize those in other ways. Now I'm going to go through with you some of the paradigms at the end of the material. And these paradigms are they cover pretty much everything, both nouns, pronouns, adjectives, irregular nouns, so on, and also weak verbs. So if you look at page, the page where the paradigms, the final chunk of the material is paradigms. You can look at, we can start looking at paradigm number 21. Paradigm number 21, that's page 9. The paradigms have separate pages. That's page 9 of the paradigms. Let me just find it here. Yeah. So that's the final hey root. Well, the root does not have a final hey as such. Of course, the hey is a vowel, but the hey does stand for this long vowel, which is the result of the yud or a vav, that is the original root letter, root consonant, which has become a vowel in most or almost all forms. So if you look at the paradigm there, you see that the perfect in the third masculine singular ends with the hey there, bana. And then in the feminine it's baneta. A tav is added to get the feminine. But other than that, none of the forms have the hey. That's because the hey only is shown in the at the end of words, and the rest of the inflection of the perfect or the suffix conjugation here is has endings. So the vowel of that the hey indicated merges, or sometimes if the ending is a vowel, or has a different vowel than the a. For instance, in the second person, the masculine singular, banita, you built. It's banita. We would expect banaita or banavta with two a's, but it's banita and so on. In the imperfect, well, the imperfect forms that do not have an ending all have an e as a gol with the hey. If they have an ending, well, then the ending removes removes the hey, you can say. And well, you have the paradigm there. The next paradigm is a particular type of final hey root, or not a particular type, but a particular verb, the verb haya, which is the verb to be. You know, the verb to be in many languages, or actually all the languages I know, are at least I can say that this language, this verb to be, is tends to be irregular. So also in Hebrew, the verb to be is somewhat irregular. Haya is the verb. It has hey in the beginning. That's a guttural. Then it has yud in the middle. That yud in the middle is always seen. Sometimes it becomes an e, but you always have the yud there. And then the final hey will drop in certain forms. So whenever you see hey yud and you think maybe you have the verb haya, you can always turn to the paradigm 22. The next paradigm, that's the initial rod yud or first yod roots, is interesting in the sense that there are no first vav roots in Hebrew, not anymore. Whenever there was supposed to be a first vav, the vav changed to a yud. Now the vav comes back, but the vav is visible still in the nifal and in the hifil. You see it there, particularly in the nifal and the hifil. The vav becomes a vowel, and so the first root consonant in the place of the first root consonant in the nifal and hifil, you get an o, a hoshiv, a noshav, and so on. So if you look at the initial yod or the first yod root in the kal, a few of them, but very important, very common roots of this type, drop the yud completely in the imperfect. See, the perfect is completely regular, but in the imperfect, the yud is dropped. You can see the forms there, and when the yud drops in the imperfect, you can also know that the yud drops in the imperative, right? We've seen that the imperative is built on top of the imperfect in the sense that you remove the prefix from the imperfect and then you get the imperative. So when the yud is not there in the imperative, in the imperfect it will not be there in the imperative. So looking at the imperative there, it's red. So yarad in the kal, perfect, he went down. Imperfect, yired, he will go down. But in the imperative, red, go down. And then with the regular endings, but red is only has two consonants, obviously red. So you'll have to know where to look in order to find it in the dictionary. Then you have the infinitive construct, which is also without the yud. So whenever this this first consonant drops in the infinitive, in the imperative, I mean, the infinitive also is without this first consonant. This goes both for when the yud is gone, but also for when the nun is gone. So in the infinitive construct, we have the form redet. Further down, next paradigm is the root halach. That's a particular type of root. It looks okay. I mean, halach, it has a guttural in the beginning, but so what? The gutturals don't disappear. Well, actually, this one does. So halach is one truly irregular verb. It behaves as if it's a first yud root. You have the inflection there, the imperfect and imperative infinitive without the hey, as if it was a first yud root. Okay, scrolling down, you find paradigm 25, which is well, you can call it middle vav root, you can call it hollow root, you can call it, well, it's one of those two radical verbs which I mentioned earlier. The two radicals, the shin and the bet, in this case, the verb shuv, and then in between them we have a long vowel. And well, they're inflected sort of slightly, well, some differently. The endings and the prefixes are the same, so that's always something. Okay. And there's also these hollow roots can have a vav in the middle. They can also have yud in the middle, so they look slightly different. Paradigm 26 is an example of this different middle yud root. When aleph is in the beginning of a root, the aleph sometimes loses its sound value completely. That's particularly the case for two very important and very common verbs, the verb amar, say, and the verb achal, eat. And they get, well, they're completely regular, almost completely regular in the perfect, but in the imperfect, they get the vowel o after the prefix, and the aleph completely loses its sound value, but it's usually there. I mean, it's there in all forms except for first person singular, where it's elided. The infinitive is also strange for the verb amar. It's lemor, infinitive construct. Usually in the Hebrew Bible, the verb amar is found in the infinitive construct with the le, and then it has this strange form lemor. So paradigm 28 is what's here called the doubled root, the geminate root. It's another, as I mentioned, another type of two radical verb, where the second radical then is long. This long consonant is sometimes dissolved into two identical short consonants, hence the term geminate root or doubled root. And well, you can see some examples of this. It's peculiar in the sense that some of the imperfect forms lengthen the first of the two consonants rather than the second of the two consonants when there's no ending. Scrolling down, paradigm 29, you see the root po, and that is well, it's a hollow root. It's a middle vav root, and it has its own paradigm. For one thing, because it's a very common root, and for another thing, because it's sort of it's not inflected entirely like the other middle vav roots, in that the final aleph also loses its sound value, as final alephs do in many forms. Other than that, it has the o instead of the u in the imperfect. But it's handy to have the paradigm there. Paradigm 30 is the root natan, very important verb. To give sometimes means to put, and it well, it has two nuns. Obviously, the final nun sometimes assimilates with endings, and the first nun assimilates with the second root consonant, the tav, in some forms, particularly in the imperfect kal. If you look at the imperfect, you see yitten, the first nun is gone, but has left a lengthened middle root consonant. That's what you find in the kal imperfect, in the nifal perfect, and also throughout the hifil. that nuns, when you have a first nun roots, the nun will disappear and be assimilated with the following consonant. And this verb has also a short imperative form, as we saw with the first yud roots. When the first consonant disappears from the imperfect form, it's also gone in the imperative, because the imperative is built on the imperfect. And again, the infinitive is also without the first consonant. So the imperative is ten, give, but the infinitive is tet. Both nuns are gone, so that's really important to know, because when you see it in text, you simply can't recognize it unless you know it. You'd have no way of finding it in the dictionary unless you know which form it is. Pattern 31 is the root lakach. Root lakach is the other very irregular root. So we had the halach just before, halach to walk or go, which was inflected like a first yud root. Now lakach is inflected like a first nun root. So in other words, the lamed is assimilated in the following consonant in imperfect kal, as you can see there, and it's gone in the imperative and infinitive construct. So in paradigm 32, you get the hifils of the first yud roots. As I mentioned briefly, there in the first yud roots in the hifil, the vav is usually there. I mean, even though they start with yud in the kal, the probably original vav is most often takes its place in the first place of the root in the nifal and hifil. Here you see the hifil. You get the prefix ho in the perfect, and yo and so on in the imperfect. And paradigm 33 then is the root halach in the hifil, which is again inflected as if it had a yud or vav as the first consonant in the root. Then we, in paradigm 34, you get the middle weak verb, the middle vav, middle yud verb, the hollow verb. In other words, two radical verbs with a consonant, with a vowel in the middle, and it is then given here in the hifil, and relatively recognizable hifil forms with the e there, the long e, except that there's only two consonants. So paradigm 35 is the initial first nun verb, initial nun verb in the hifil, where, as I said before, the nun also is assimilated into the second root consonant, leaving a lengthened second root consonant. For instance, higid, right? Higid from the root nagad. It should be hin-gid in principle, but it becomes higid. So gimel, which is then the second root consonant, is lengthened. And well, after the paradigms, you have charts, real charts with the verb, which hopefully is helpful to you. And for reading Hebrew Bible, you can now turn to the Bible, because we have gone through all the important parts of the Hebrew grammar. Now, what you have to do is practice. Hopefully, you can use the exercises and not least the charts and paradigms in your work with Hebrew. There are good resources, free resources on the net. The best one that I know of is BibleHub.com, where you find great grammatical information for Hebrew, for reading Hebrew. So it's been a pleasure. Good luck and goodbye.